Okay, we're starting and it's recorded. So we are students, and as students, we've learned about American and global history multiple times in multiple classes. But I think for some of the most important topics that affect modern politics, we too often learn about only a fraction, one, two factors, but always told from the same perspective, and never the complete story. Now, we are by this system covertly cajoled into being torpid parrots. A lot of buzzwords there. For example, of the Cold War or anything like that, right? We learn very little. In fact, we learn so little, it can pretty much be summed up by the following statement: capitalist US good, communist USSR bad. Anyone who makes broad assertions like that is probably wrong. So to understand the events and the implications of the Cold War, for instance, we must venture beyond these statements and try to understand things from multiple perspectives. One of which is that of the Soviets, the one that we too often don't hear. So let's tell the story of the Cold War factually, as the USSR viewed it. The story that we never really hear. We always hear the US side of the story, but let's tell the USSR perspective of the Cold War. Now, the point of this isn't to defend the Soviet Union or offend the United States. The point is just, to get us to understand how others think by recognizing biases that we might encounter, whether it be in politics or history. So, yeah, ignore that. A lot of the research that I did for this comes from this book, The Triumph of Evil. I would really recommend it. So let's begin. World War II set the stage for the Cold War. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan was also invading places. Now, through the sacrifice and endurance of the Soviet soldiers who did most of the work, the German advance was eventually halted. Also, if anyone has any questions or wants to say something, just, say it. The USSR, after all, made it so 8 out of 10 German casualties were on the Eastern Front. Within a few years, only Japan remained. The Soviet army was advancing in Manchuria and Korea, just as the United States used nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan, both to fight the fascists and send a threat for the Soviets. Now, when the war ended, Japan was to be occupied, almost exclusively by the United States. The USSR got some minor and basically useless islands, but Japan never officially recognized these Kuril Islands, and they still cause disputes to this day. Now, all this unfair treatment completely ignored all accomplishments made by the USSR in the region, such as defeating the Kwantung Army or leading the Japanese to an unconditional surrender. Yes, that's right. Now, you might have heard that the US atomic bombs led to Japan's surrender, but if we're analyzing the Cold War from the USSR perspective, in their perspective, it was the USSR's war entry that led to Japan's surrender, because the war entry opened up another front, and suddenly Japan was faced with a tactical, really a puzzle. So not the atomic bombs for the USSR's perspective, and thus the USSR expedited Japan's surrender, whereas the US use of nuclear weapons, in the USSR's point of view, was unnecessary, bloody, and criminal. But thereafter, the capitalist West and the Soviet Union decided that the Eastern countries were to be rebuilt by the Soviet Union, and the Western ones by the US, UK, France. Germany was right in the middle, and it was split up again between the USSR and the capitalist nations, with Berlin in East Germany split up again. Now, the Soviet Union admittedly struggled in supporting their Eastern Bloc nations in East Germany, as it had to rebuild itself first. That's because the USSR suffered to a much greater extent than the West did in World War II, as mentioned prior, especially the US, considering that the US was attacked on its own soil, but it never even had to fight, two sides on its own soil. Now, eventually, the Western nations instituted the free market in West Germany, and it was absolutely terrible from the USSR's point of view. And again, that's the whole thing is just going to be written from the USSR's point of view. So eventually, you had that free market. There was massive inflation, abhorrent production conditions. Everything was terrible. So the US government, in typical capitalist fashion, gave away money, just free money, to pro tempore stimulate the economy via the Marshall Plan. To be more specific, but capitalist nations that were given US dollars, and they had to use those on importing US goods. Now, the US then used this political leverage that they got to influence these nations' elections, essentially turning the Western Europe into an economic area of puppet states. Now, soon after, many similar ideas materialized, in part due to what was known as the Bretton Woods Conference. This conference, in a New World Order fashion, it created the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all of these things. And all of these things, from the USSR's perspective, gave the US supreme malevolent power. Now, as a result, much of the West was shaped solely by American puppeteers. But in spite of this new world order, there was still severe economic hardship in the US. US tanks even had to come in and quench rebellions in Stuttgart. And just as these people were unhappy, so too was the General Secretary of the USSR, Stalin. Now, the USSR deemed the German partition, seen here, unfair, as pretty much all natural resources and industry of Germany are located outside of the Soviet zone, pretty much all in the West, right? Now, the USSR had lost the most blood and won the most ground territory in defeating fascism. So it felt like it deserved a richer area to pay reparations. Since the only major industrial area in the Soviet zone was Berlin, right there, Stalin wanted all of it. So that the USSR could pay its due reparations and finish industrializing. So Stalin demanded that the Allies stop occupying Berlin. As you can see here, the Allies were in an enclave inside Berlin, which was inside East Germany. So when the Allies refused to leave, Stalin blockaded it. And this Berlin blockade, in which the capitalists violated international law, was the first conflict of the Cold War. All right, let's keep going. So in this conflict, the West used planes to fly their supplies in, and Stalin stopped the blockade after about a year. And then Stalin graciously gave Germany a state of their own, the German Democratic Republic. Now, but Stalin really wanted to, eventually, create a unified and democratic Germany with international supervision. He had requested this multiple times. The Western nations declined this offer. They were worried that Germany might democratically vote to become fully a socialist. Now, they were so stalwart in their opposition that the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, outright prepared a plan for invading the USSR, and the US Army was constructing facilities with nuclear bombs around the world. Totally not escalatory. But by 1949, the USSR too had tested its first nuclear warhead. So let's go back to the 1940s though, and have a look at China, which was in a civil war. The belligerents were the Communist People's Liberation Army under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and the basically fascist Chinese Nationalist Party under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. They'd been fighting each other since before World War II. Now, betraying his predecessor, Chiang Kai-shek furthered crimes and the divisions between communists and nationalists by basically massacring all of them that he could. But in the end, the communists actually won, leaving Mao Zedong at the helm, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, where they remain today. Now, Taiwan has, with American support and funds, importantly, Taiwan has threatened to nuke and threatened to invade mainland China several times since then. In nearby Korea, there was a temporary provisional government set up on the peninsula, the People's Republic of Korea. Then the US military just set up shop, as they do, in the southern part, disregarding the will of the people and replacing Japan as the imperialist power in the area. They installed a puppet dictator in the south named Syngman Rhee, who basically just massacred every suspected communist, and he even attacked the north several times prior to the Korean War. Now, by 1950, the north, under Kim Il-sung, decided to preemptively strike the south, after some intelligence indicated that the south was going to attack again. So thus the north started a liberation war against the southern dictatorship. When prospects looked grim for the south, many capitalist nations came to help the dictatorship, and the North Korean army was pushed back. Now, Chairman Mao of China, as we mentioned earlier, he decided to give military support to North Korea, a fellow communist nation. And after 3 years, the fronts were basically back to where they were before. And Korean governments agreed on an armistice, which is still in power to this day. Now, post-war, the South Koreans endured several US-backed dictatorships, all of which did nothing to help their people economically. The North actually had way better living standards by all objective measures until 1987. Poverty, literacy, all these things. In 1987, though, South Korea moved to an illiberal democracy. Even though they still ban leftist groups, they still have rigged elections, and they still harbor thousands of US troops ready to attack. Now, meanwhile, in the US, much like under Syngman Rhee, everyone who was a communist or suspected communist was fired, arrested, or worse in the McCarthy era. Now, throughout all this, the US still claimed to support freedom of expression and speech and claimed to oppose penal labor, surveillance, and secret police. But the US actually had and has all these things. Remember, it's the US that has ICE, the CIA, FBI, NSA, and more, which have spied on Americans for decades, especially against suspected communists. It's the US that had Japanese internment camps. The US at this point in the 50s still had Jim Crow segregation. That's important to remember. Now, comparing that to the USSR and their perspective, well, visitors from the US noted when visiting the USSR that they felt, quote, for the first time like a human being. No color prejudice, as in Mississippi. No color prejudice, as in Washington. They walked in full human dignity, end quote. Now, that's because the Soviet Constitution banned discrimination by race, religion, and more, something entirely lacking in Jim Crow America. But they also made significant gender progress, although some propaganda, from the USSR's perspective, wouldn't have taught us that. Well, women couldn't even vote in the US in 1917. The fledgling USSR not only had that, but they also appointed the first female, basically, cabinet position in the world. And furthermore, for gender equality, in the 1970 Supreme Soviet, kind of like Congress, women accounted for 20% of members and 45% in the smaller local Soviets. In the 1970 American Senate, there was one female senator with 10 female representatives. If we combine those bicamerally, that's 2%. So compare 2% to either 20 or 45%. Now, in terms of gender, the USSR, as I hope we can see here, was actually so progressive that it actually caused them to not produce nearly enough light industry goods and things like that. And that's a major reason why a lot of people say the USSR could have done better. The USSR saw these personal kitchen consumer goods, as trapping women in the home. And so I hope we can see how progressive they truly were on this front. Yet the USSR was still viewed as intolerant by the Western capitalists. All right, let's keep analyzing their perspective. This time we can go to East Germany. Now, their centrally planned economy was not doing as good as the West, which is true. Mostly because it was smaller in the beginning, so of course it wouldn't be doing as good, but also it didn't have access to the Marshall Plan's free money, which certainly helps. But there were still many upsides, like 0% unemployment, free healthcare, free higher education, etc. West Germany had none of these at this time. And the East was particularly prosperous in education. They had many highly trained innovators, trained by the state and expected to do work. In response to this, the West, angrily, decided to hand out more free money to everyone with a higher education from East Germany who would move to West Germany, basically a bribe. They also spread lots of propaganda about the fruits of capitalism. So young people decided to leave to a capitalist country in false hopes of making themselves rich off of their stolen East German education. Now, this increased tensions, as did, by the way, the abundance of Cold War spies from both the East and the West, and they are related. So in order to stop the education traitors and the spies, which were a perpetual problem, East Germany decided to impose a border in Berlin. This meant border guards, checkpoints, barbed wire, no crossing without a reason, actually nothing radical for the time or area. And the West was quick to complain about the Berlin Wall, as it became known, crying that East Germany had torn Berlin apart. And that's a pretty bold statement, right? But let's try to look at this objectively from another perspective. The Western powers continued to occupy half the capital city of another country, and yet they were saying, oh my goodness, you're tearing the city apart. Okay, that's like Saudi Arabia occupying half of Washington, D.C., and then complaining about the U.S. tearing D.C. apart if the U.S. tries to guard their border. And the statement about tearing the city apart wasn't even accurate, by the way. East Germans were allowed to visit the West, and the West was allowed to visit the East, provided they had a reason. Marriage, funeral, anything like that. Visiting a friend. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin died, and his successor Khrushchev began distancing from his legacy. And this started a tradition of Soviet leaders being condemned once they died, something that did not help with stability. It also contributed to the Sino-Soviet split, which worsened Chinese relations and emboldened the US. So then the capitalists banded together and formed NATO. Actually, they did this before, but anyway. That was an aggressive military alliance designed to threaten the Soviet Union and contain the revolution. So in order to counter NATO, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance not for the purpose of going after the US, but for the purpose of countering NATO, which was built first. Now, during this time, some Soviet scientists were innovating on all things, particularly in rocket technology, much more successfully than the West, by the way. For the benefit of humanity, the USSR wanted to learn stuff about space. And after a bit of development, they managed to put the first ever artificial satellite in space, Sputnik. It was just a little, silver ball, beep, 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 in space. But it was a tremendous achievement for humanity. And it was certainly seen as an achievement for humanity and global science, and not one for the nation alone in the USSR. But the capitalist nations reacted differently. They were scared of Sputnik because suddenly they saw that the socialist nations were technologically superior. The US then decided to do the same thing. So they tried. Their first rocket blew up in front of the launch pad in the whole world. Then the Soviet Union sent a dog to space, which was the first animal in space. They then did the first spacewalk to the first picture of the dark side of the moon, did the first automated landing on the moon and another planet, put the first woman in space, we had the first space station, all of these things. And yet the capitalists complain that communism does not innovate. Interesting. Anyway, the US, lagging behind, importantly, made none of these achievements during this time. So they were incredibly desperate. And so they launched a literal moonshot program. That is, they wanted to land people on the moon. And they enlisted the help of literal genocidal Nazis like Werner von Braun. And they had a bunch of explosive disasters, but eventually, to their credit, they made it to the moon. Unless you believe that that didn't happen, but that's just Alex Jones territory. Then they stuck their flag into the moon, presumably to try to make it theirs. And, they declared that they had won the space race, even though looking at this picture, you can't really say that. It's not really accurate. The USSR never acted this selfishly with space. Let's be clear. The USSR even tried suggesting a joint moon landing, right? Which, to his credit, JFK actually, agreed to. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, refused. So even though JFK, to his credit, wanted a joint moon landing, he still had many flaws. Let's be clear on that. And that was particularly true, I think, when it came to Cuba. Cuba, though nominally independent, in practice belongs to the US, which exploited and murdered the Cuban people for profit. So then you had these two, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And they overthrew the US-backed fascist, basically, Batista dictatorship. Now, to this day, the US still has a naval base and torture site on the island, illegally. Let's keep that in mind. That's like if Russia had a torture site in suburban Florida. I'm sure we would not be happy if that happened, but because it's in Cuba, apparently it's okay. Now, because Cuba was after this revolution, thereafter socialist, the US tried to invade, as they do when a country votes when they don't like it. But the US actually failed in this invasion in what became known as the Bay of Pigs debacle. Now, the Americans hoped that by hiring CIA-backed Cuban exiles for an armed attack on Cuba, they could rally the people of Cuba to depose of Castro. But because Castro was very popular, that uprising never happened. The move by the US proved its imperialist aggression, and it gave Cuba more military aid from the USSR for defense. By attempting an invasion and losing, the US, which claimed to care about free speech for all, except when denouncing the US, proved Castro's point. and the USSR's point. During this time, NATO was becoming even more aggressive. Turkey had just joined a few years prior, and the US had set up nuclear missiles there, which could directly attack Moscow and kill millions of people. After the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet General Secretary called and asked if they wanted to help do the same to the US in retaliation for the Bay of Pigs. So Cuba agreed, and the USSR was about to place missiles there when the Americans noticed. The US president did not want to allow the USSR to do the same, as they had done, so they forbade Cuba to place the Soviet missiles there. Importantly, no complete missiles were ever actually there, by the way. They were just under construction. Anyway, once this was known, the US began a blockade on Cuba, which they enforced by throwing depth charges at Soviet submarines, which were armed with nuclear weapons. The world came within 1 millimeter of war, nuclear war, because the hypocritical capitalists didn't want to allow other countries to do as the US had just done. So they decided attacking a nuclear submarine was somehow a good idea. In the end, the US agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, and the USSR agreed not to put them in Cuba. However, the USSR didn't publicly announce its missile removal until much after the USSR did, which was very disingenuous and made the USSR look bad and weak. The US still thought they got a bad deal, though, so they began what was known as Operation Mongoose, which consisted of further acts of war. First, there was the embargo, trade ban, designed to destroy the then designed to destroy the then US-dependent Cuban economy. Then the CIA engaged in literal acts of terrorism, killing civilians, destroying bridges, setting fire to storage facilities, destroying sugar harvests, trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, which, by the way, trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, that's like if Vladimir Putin tried to assassinate Justin Trudeau, okay? Like, the whole point of this is, to try to think of things from a different perspective. And it's pretty crazy to think about that if we think about it like if Putin tried to assassinate Justin Trudeau or even Boris Johnson or whoever, right? Now, Latin America was especially redundant during the Cold War. It's basically always the same story. You have this economically undiversified country. They elect a socialist government, and they try to help the poor, and they actually succeed in many ways. Then the US is worried about its business monopolies in the region. So it uses its CIA, and it stages a coup, and it kills pretty much all suspected communists, and props up a fascist puppet dictatorship there, which lasts for decades and kills more people. Now, all this messes up the country's reforms just so the US can claim socialism doesn't work. That's right. The US outright invaded dozens of countries and killed hundreds of thousands just because democratically elected leftist leaders wanted to, say, redistribute land, cap corporate profits, so on. The American corporate interests wouldn't let that happen. That's why the US destroyed buildings, blew up bridges, blackmailed citizens, installed dictators, all these things, just because they didn't like electoral favorability. That's why the US did coups and massacres in Guatemala, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Panama, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Grenada, Iran. We could go on. Oh, and this map, by the way, is just of American regime change only in Latin America and only during the Cold War. And it's basically just a map of the Americas. Like pretty much every country in Latin America is filled in. But if you thought that was bad, wait until we talk about Vietnam. So prior, France had colonized what they called Indochina. After World War II, they decided that they had to split it up into what is today 3 countries: Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia became monarchies, but in Vietnam, more people preferred to be communists. So the world's powers split Vietnam up into zones of influence. Tentatively, the North would be communist and the South would be basically capitalist. And in 2 years, they would unify, and there'd be one election, and they'd all decide what system the whole of Vietnam should use. Unfortunately, that election never happened. Well, nationalist communist groups under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, pictured here, rebelled against the French. Now, the French just refused to leave entirely. Ho Chi Minh, interestingly, he actually used to look up to the US and its ideals of liberty, justice, all these things. until he saw how the US betrayed them. The US kind of replaced France as the dominant colonial imperialist power in the region, and the US didn't want Ho Chi Minh, a communist whom everyone knew would win, to win the democratic election. So the US slowly became more and more involved in Vietnam, until eventually they were at war, where they committed war crimes and killed more than 1 million people. Now, due to several factors, such as guerrilla war, the US had to retreat, and they lost, in humiliation, in 1974, giving up while pretending that they totally won. The capitalist South fell within 1 year, and all of Vietnam was socialist, with Vietnamese characteristics, of course. On the other side of the continent, the Afghanistan government was overthrown by a new socialist government called the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. It was attacked by reactionaries and asked the Soviets for help. So in 1979, the USSR tried to intervene and prevent a reactionary coup and help comrades with their revolution, right? The US gave lots of money to rebels fighting the USSR, and the US helped these rebels, most notably the Mujahideen. They would later be known as Al-Qaeda. That's right, the US gave money to what basically turned into Al-Qaeda. After about 10 years, the Soviet government decided they could no longer do this and just left. The reactionary armies unfortunately won, and in 2001, they blew up 2 towers in New York City with US resources and training. That did not go well for the US. Now, right after this, the USSR cooled down tensions. The US was still trying to build this weird Reagan Star Wars space shield thing, but eventually, bowing to lowering approval and international pressure, Reagan signed Gorbachev's proposed treaty, which limited arms and limited tensions. Now, things like this were happening all over the socialist world. Back in 1980s Germany, they'd been talking about letting people travel over the international border without prerequisites. Then Gunter Schabowski, this guy, misread something in a press briefing, and as a result, everyone thought, they could just cross the border now. Eventually, the border guards couldn't hold them anymore, and they decided to let them through. So the wall was gone. Now, did these people want to live in the West? No. Did they want to be united? No. 71% of East Germans opposed reunification. That's an important thing to take away. Then we had Gorbachev come into power in the USSR and implemented perestroika and glasnost, which were reforms to communism that had to do with economic restructuring and increased government transparency. In the process, he created a bunch of new government positions. And he ended up messing it up pretty badly, so badly that there was a coup, and that led to countries like Ukraine and Estonia to declare independence. They took advantage of the situation. Bit by bit, the union fell apart. Now, at that point, Gorbachev resigned from his effectively useless position, giving power to the new reactionary president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, a right-wing extremist. No one likes him, by the way. His approval rating was like 3% at the end of his term. And this is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, an event which most people from the Soviet Union to this day wish had never happened. So does it sound like I'm an evil Russian indoctrination bot? Okay, maybe. But keep in mind, everything I said is true. It's all 100% true, factually. So why does this seem so deceiving, right? Because we aren't used to hearing this side of a story. We always hear about the Berlin Wall tearing families apart, but we never hear about the US invading countries just because they don't like how an election goes in a different country, a sovereign country. We always hear about Soviet aggression in Cuba, but we never hear about the US missiles in Turkey or firing at nuclear submarines. We always hear one side and we never hear the other. Though still, the Soviet story is just as biased as the American one. Frankly, I'd like to hear a story without bias for once. And ultimately, that might be impossible. But at least now we can understand some of these biases, how to detect them, and all these things. And while bias might be an omnipresent phenomena, through this kind of analysis, we can slowly determine the true nature of our past and where we should go in the future, politically, economically, humanly, to make the world a better place, where all do well and all do good. That was a long presentation, but that's pretty much it for that, Cold War from the USSR's perspective. So quickly, I wanted to say something. What do we think of switching meetings to start at 4:30 and end at 5? Because I feel like that would work better for, more people. Anyone have any thoughts? Okay, I think that would work. Okay, I will send out something on that. We'll talk about it a bit more. I know it's 4:31. Make sure, if you're interested in this kind of thing, if you want to give a presentation, just let me know. Uh, you can contact us on our social media at LHSYPC, whatever. Try to bring friends, bring new members, whatever. Yeah, again, if anyone has any feedback or whatever, just let us
If
know.
if we started at 4:30 and went till 5, I don't think Zach would be able to go to the meetings. Just saying. But he's not here right now. I think he had to leave for work.
Worse for people that work. Okay. So it seems like some people, maybe there's like a medium we can do, like 4:10, 4:15. Yeah. What about 4:15 to 4:45? All right. And that's my phone number. If anyone wants to reach out to me for whatever reason. This is probably one of my last presentations, at least this year, because we have a bunch of stuff scheduled. Senatorial candidate Dan Allers is coming. We have a bunch more guests that we're going to have, and other presentations coming up soon. So thank you all for coming to the presentation. I hope we learned something. I hope you all had fun. And yeah, make sure to do well and do good. Bye, everyone.